Imagine it's February 2019. You're a middle school teacher named Sandra in suburban Ohio. Every Sunday you do the same thing you've done for the past 12 years. You drive to the same grocery store, you buy roughly the same items. Bread, milk, eggs, ground beef, vegetables, maybe some cereal for the kids. Your cart fills the same way it always does, and when you reach the checkout, you know what to expect. Around $140? Maybe $150 if you splurged on something. You don't think about this number. It's just background noise of life. Like the electric bill or the mortgage payment. It exists. It's stable. It's predictable. It's boring. Now imagine it's 2024. Same store. Same items. Same cart. Same Sunday routine. $270. You stand at the register, staring at the screen. Something must be wrong. You bought less than you used to. You skipped the brand name cereal. You didn't buy the premium cuts. You chose the store brand milk. You did everything right. And yet, Sandra looks at her receipt the way a patient looks at a diagnosis they weren't expecting. Not with anger, not even with confusion. With the dawning realization that something fundamental has changed and no one explained it to her. Here's what I want you to understand today. Sandra isn't experiencing a temporary spike. She isn't caught in a pricing cycle that will correct itself. She's standing at the edge of a permanent structural shift in how food is priced, produced, and distributed in the modern economy. And she's never going back. This isn't theory. It's documented history. It's embedded mathematics. It's the inevitable outcome of decisions made over decades, accelerated by shocks that cannot be undone. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand why no politician, no policy, no return to normal will ever bring your grocery bill back to 2019 levels. Not because of corporate greed, not because of supply chain chaos, but because the architecture of food pricing has been permanently rebuilt around you. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with what most people believe. The popular explanation for rising grocery prices follows a simple narrative. The pandemic disrupted supply chains. Russia invaded Ukraine, affecting grain exports. Energy prices spiked. Labor became expensive. These shocks hit the system. Prices rose. And eventually, as the shocks fade, prices will normalize. This is what economists call transitory thinking. The idea that we're experiencing a deviation from trend that will mean revert. It's the same logic the Federal Reserve applied to inflation in 2021. Transitory, they said. 18 months later, inflation hit a 40-year high, and they quietly retired the word. The transitory narrative is comforting because it implies passivity is rational. Just wait. Things will fix themselves. But the transitory narrative misses something fundamental. Some shocks don't reverse. Some shocks reveal structural fragilities that were always there, and some shocks create new equilibriums that the old system cannot return to. What happened to food prices between 2020 and 2024 is not a temporary deviation. It's a permanent reset. Let me show you why. The first mechanism is the one hiding in plain sight. Between March 2020 and March 2022, the United States Federal Reserve expanded the monetary base by approximately $4.8 trillion. That's new money. Money that didn't exist before, created digitally, injected into the system through asset purchases, emergency lending facilities, and direct transfers. To put this in perspective, in the entire history of the United States prior to 2020, the total monetary base was approximately $3.4 trillion. In 2 years, the Federal Reserve added more new money than had existed in the entire prior history of the nation. This isn't controversial. It's public Federal Reserve data. Now, here's the mechanism most people don't understand. When you inject new currency units into an economy, those units don't distribute evenly. They enter through specific channels. In 2020 and 2021, those channels were asset markets first, then consumer pockets through stimulus payments, then gradually into the real economy. But money is persistent. Unlike a supply chain bottleneck, which resolves when ships dock and trucks move, money doesn't go away. It circulates. It embeds itself into the cost structure. When a meatpacking plant pays higher wages because workers have more options during stimulus, those wages don't drop when stimulus ends. They become the new baseline. When a trucking company raises rates because fuel spiked and drivers demanded more, those rates become contracted into long-term agreements. When a grocery chain raises prices to cover increased input costs, they don't lower them when costs stabilize. They hold the new margin. This is called ratchet pricing. Prices go up quickly. They come down slowly, if ever. And when the underlying monetary supply has permanently expanded, there's no mechanism to reverse the nominal price level. Think about what this means. The dollars in your bank account are the same digits they were in 2019, but each digit now purchases less food, not because the food is more valuable, but because the dollar is structurally diluted. This is not inflation in the classical sense. This is a permanent repricing of the unit of account. History gives us exact parallels. After World War II, the United States experienced a similar monetary expansion to fund the war effort. Between 1940 and 1945, the money supply roughly tripled. When the war ended, prices did not return to 1940 levels. They stabilized at the new higher plateau. A loaf of bread that cost 8 cents in 1940 cost 14 cents in 1948. It never went back. After the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 and the dollar fully severed its link to gold, the purchasing power of the dollar entered a one-way decline. A dollar in 1971 purchased roughly the equivalent of $6.50 today. It never reversed. The pattern is consistent. Monetary expansion reprices the economy. The new level becomes permanent. Your 2019 grocery bill doesn't exist anymore. The dollar that paid for it isn't the same dollar you hold today. But wait, if this were only about money supply, prices would have risen uniformly. Everything would be roughly 30% more expensive. That's not what happened. Food prices rose faster than overall inflation, significantly faster. While cumulative inflation from 2019 to 2024 was roughly 22% by official CPI measurement, food at home prices rose over 28%, eggs spiked over 100% at one point, butter rose by over 30%, beef nearly 30%. Why? Because food sits at the intersection of multiple compounding systems, and each of those systems has experienced its own structural shift. Let's take energy first. Modern agriculture is not farming in any traditional sense. It's applied chemistry and logistics. Nitrogen fertilizer, the foundation of crop yields, is produced through the Haber-Bosch process, which requires massive energy inputs, primarily natural gas. The tractors that plow fields run on diesel. The trucks that transport grain run on diesel. The refrigeration units that produce fresh run on electricity. The plastic packaging comes from petroleum. When energy prices spike, food prices spike. That's not controversial. But here's what's structural. The era of cheap energy is over. From roughly 1985 to 2020, global oil markets operated in a relative equilibrium. OPEC managed supply. Shale production balanced demand. Natural gas prices remained suppressed by oversupply. Energy-intensive industries built their cost structures around these assumptions. That equilibrium has fractured. Shale production in the United States, which drove the energy price collapse from 2014 to 2020, is now facing geological exhaustion in key basins. The Permian Basin, which produces nearly half of U.S. shale oil, is seeing rig productivity decline and drilling cost increases. The easy oil has been extracted. What remains is harder and more expensive. Globally, investment in new oil and gas production collapsed during the pandemic. From 2014 to 2021, upstream capital expenditure in oil and gas dropped by over 40%. Those projects take 5 to 10 years to produce. The supply hole is already baked in. Meanwhile, demand continues to rise. Global population growth, industrialization in Asia and Africa, electrification, which paradoxically increases natural gas demand for electricity generation in the short term. The result is a new energy pricing floor, not a spike, a floor. And that floor is built into every calorie you eat. Now layer in consolidation. The American food system is not a free market. It's an oligopoly. 4 companies control 85% of beef processing in the United States. Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef. 4 companies, 85%. For pork, 4 companies control 70%. For chicken, 4 companies control 60%. In grocery retail, 4 chains control over 45% of all grocery sales. Walmart, Kroger, Albertsons, and Costco. In food distribution, 3 companies handle the majority of all products that move from factory to shelf. This is not an accident. It's the result of 40 years of regulatory permissiveness, aggressive merger activity, and deliberate market strategy. And here's what consolidation does to prices. When an industry consolidates to 4 or fewer major players, those players don't need to compete aggressively on price. They don't even need to collude explicitly. They simply observe each other's pricing, recognize that price wars destroy everyone's margin, and settle into parallel pricing behavior. This is called tacit coordination. It's legal, it's rational, and it creates permanent pricing power. When input costs rise, consolidated industries pass those costs through to consumers immediately. When input costs fall, they hold prices steady and absorb the margin. This is exactly what the data shows. In 2022, when input costs for beef processing spiked due to cattle supply disruptions, retail beef prices rose immediately. Consumers paid the cost within weeks. When cattle supplies normalized in 2023, retail prices did not fall. The major processors reported record profit margins instead. JBS, the largest meat processor in the world, reported operating margins in 2023 that were double their pre-pandemic average. Tyson reported similar expansion. These weren't windfall profits from efficiency. They were margin captures from pricing power. The same pattern played out in eggs. Cal-Maine, the largest egg producer in the United States, reported profit increases of over 400% during the avian flu outbreak of 2022. When the outbreak subsided, Egg prices remained elevated for months beyond what supply data would justify. This isn't greed in a moral sense, it's structure. When you control the market, you set the price, and no one is structured to stop you. Now consider labor. Food production is one of the most labor-intensive industries in the economy. Meatpacking, warehouse operations, trucking, retail stocking. These jobs cannot be automated easily. They require human bodies doing physical work. Between 2020 and 2023, the labor market for these roles fundamentally changed. First, pandemic health concerns created worker shortages. Many meatpacking plants became COVID hotspots. Workers quit, facilities slowed. Immigration enforcement under the prior administration had already tightened labor supply in agriculture and processing, which rely heavily on immigrant workers. Second, stimulus payments and expanded unemployment benefits gave workers financial breathing room. For the first time, many low-wage workers had leverage. They demanded higher pay. They demanded better conditions. And in a tight labor market, employers had to concede. Third, and this is critical, once wages rise, they don't fall. Wage stickiness is one of the most robust findings in labor economics. Workers resist pay cuts with far more intensity than they resist foregone raises. Employers know this. They build the new wage into their permanent cost structure. The average hourly wage for food manufacturing workers rose from approximately $17 in 2019 to over $21 in 2024. That's a 24% increase. That cost is now permanent. It's embedded in every package of processed food, every shipment, every checkout transaction. And those workers aren't getting cheaper. Now let's talk about what happens next. You might think, okay, the system adjusted. Input costs rose, they're now stable. Prices should at least stop rising. But they won't, because the food system is now hitting the next phase, adaptation costs. Climate change is restructuring where and how food can be grown. The western United States, which produces the majority of fruits, vegetables, and nuts, is experiencing chronic water stress. California, which grows over 50% of U.S. fruits and vegetables, has faced recurring droughts that have forced fallowing of productive farmland. This isn't a temporary drought cycle. The Colorado River Basin, which supplies water to 7 western states and irrigates millions of acres, is experiencing structural decline. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 largest reservoirs, have dropped to levels that threaten the legal water allocations of entire states. Farmers are adapting. They're drilling deeper wells. They're paying more for water rights. They're switching to less water-intensive crops. Each of these adaptations costs money. That cost passes to you. In the Midwest, the corn and soybean belt, changing precipitation patterns are creating new volatility. More frequent floods, more intense droughts, less predictable planting windows. Crop insurance payouts, which are federally subsidized, have increased dramatically over the past decade. Those subsidies come from taxes. You pay them whether you see them or not. Globally, extreme weather events are disrupting the food trade. In 2022, India banned rice exports after a monsoon failure. Pakistan, a major rice producer, lost significant acreage to flooding. Argentina, a top beef and soybean exporter, faced the worst drought in 60 years. The global food system was built on the assumption of relatively stable climate patterns. That assumption is no longer valid, and the costs of adapting to volatility are only beginning. Let me pause here and name the constraint clearly. The food system has experienced a simultaneous shift across 5 dimensions. 1. Monetary expansion that permanently diluted the purchasing power of the dollar. 2. Energy repricing that raised the floor on every input cost. 3. Consolidation that eliminated competitive pressure on prices. 4. Labor repricing that embedded higher wages into the cost structure. 5. Climate adaptation that creates ongoing compounding cost increases. None of these factors are temporary. None of them reverse on their own, and they compound. This is the trap. There is no policy lever that reverses all 5. The Federal Reserve cannot unprint money without collapsing the asset markets that now depend on that liquidity. Energy production cannot return to 2015 economics without massive capital investment that takes a decade to materialize. Antitrust action against food consolidation would take years of litigation and face fierce industry opposition. Wages cannot be reduced without triggering labor unrest and political backlash. Climate change cannot be reversed on any human timescale. Each of these constraints is individually difficult to address. Together, they form an interlocking system that creates a new permanent pricing equilibrium. Your grocery bill is not going back to 2019. It cannot. History tells us what happens next. When populations experience permanent cost increases for essential goods, they adapt. They don't adapt happily. They adapt out of necessity. In Germany after World War I, food prices rose so dramatically that urban workers spent 80 to 90% of their income on food alone. They couldn't afford rent. They couldn't save. They worked to eat, nothing more. This created the social instability that contributed to the Weimar Republic's collapse. In Venezuela, after 2015, when currency collapse and economic mismanagement destroyed purchasing power, families adapted by eating less protein. Malnutrition increased. Household composition changed as extended families pooled resources. People skipped meals, not because food wasn't available, because they couldn't afford it. In the United States, during the 1970s stagflation period, food price inflation averaged over 8% per year for nearly a decade. American families adapted by changing what they ate. Cheaper cuts of meat, more processed foods, more meals at home. The processed food industry boomed precisely because it offered caloric density at lower cost. We are now in an adaptation phase. American households are already showing the signs. Store brand purchases have increased dramatically. Private label grocery products now account for over 20% of all grocery sales, up from around 17% pre-pandemic. Discount retailers like Aldi and Lidl are growing market share faster than traditional grocers. But these adaptations have limits. Store brands still experience the same input cost pressures as name brands. Switching from Kraft to Kirkland saves you 20%, not 80%. The margin of adaptation compresses as all products rise together. Meanwhile, the psychological burden grows. Food is not an optional purchase. You cannot defer it. You cannot cancel the subscription. Every week, you must go to the store, see the prices, and pay them. This creates what psychologists call repeated salience. The pain of high prices is experienced 52 times a year. It accumulates. This is why food inflation is politically radioactive. Not because it's the largest expense for most households. It isn't. But because it's the most visible, most frequent, and most emotionally charged. Governments know this, which is why they try to manage it, and mostly fail. Consider the political impossibility. Politicians hate food inflation. They can survive high gas prices by blaming foreign oil. They can survive high housing costs by targeting landlords or developers. But food inflation is ambient. It's everywhere. It feels personal. So what do? Option 1, price controls. The government mandates maximum prices for essential goods. This has been tried. It has never worked. In 1971, President Nixon implemented wage and price controls, including on food. Within 2 years, the controls created distortions so severe that they had to be lifted. Farmers reduced production because controlled prices made farming unprofitable. Shortages emerged. Black markets formed. When controls were lifted, prices spiked higher than they would have otherwise. In Venezuela, the Chavez and Maduro governments implemented price controls on food for over a decade. The result was chronic shortages, empty shelves, and eventual economic collapse. When you tell farmers they cannot sell corn above a certain price, they stop growing corn. Price controls attack the symptom while worsening the disease. Option 2, subsidies. The government pays producers to keep prices low. This already exists. American agriculture receives tens of billions of dollars in annual subsidies, primarily through the Farm Bill. These subsidies suppress consumer prices for certain goods, particularly corn and soybeans, which flow into processed foods. But subsidies have limits. They cost money. That money comes from either taxes or borrowing. Taxes reduce consumer spending power elsewhere. Borrowing adds to the debt, which eventually creates its own inflationary pressure. And subsidies don't address the structural cost increases. They just shift who pays. Option 3, do nothing. Let the market adjust. This is politically untenable. A politician who tells constituents that groceries will never be affordable again does not get reelected. So they make promises. They blame corporations. They announce investigations. They hold hearings. None of it changes the underlying math. Let me tell you about the shrinkflation phenomenon because it reveals something important about how the system adapts. Shrinkflation is the practice of reducing product size while maintaining price. Instead of raising the price of a cereal box from $4 to $5, you reduce the box from 18 ounces to 15 ounces and keep it at $4. Consumers don't notice immediately. The box looks similar. The price is the same. Only when they calculate price per ounce do they see the true increase. Shrinkflation has accelerated dramatically since 2020. Academic researchers tracking product sizes found that over 30% of commonly purchased grocery items experienced size reductions between 2020 and 2024. Toilet paper rolls, cereal boxes, chip bags, ice cream containers. The list is extensive. This is a signal of something important. Companies know that explicit price increases trigger consumer backlash, so they hide the increase. They maintain the illusion of stability while extracting more per unit. But shrinkflation cannot continue indefinitely. Eventually, the product becomes absurdly small. Eventually, consumers notice. Eventually, the true price must be acknowledged. We are approaching that point. Many products have shrunk to the limit of packaging practicality. A chip bag can only get so small before it's obviously empty air. An ice cream container can only shrink so much before it looks comical in the freezer. The next phase is explicit price increases. And those increases will be permanent. Now let's consider who bears the cost. Inflation, especially food inflation, is a regressive tax. It takes a larger percentage from those who have less. A family earning $40,000 a year spends approximately 35% of their income on food and housing. A family earning $200,000 spends approximately 15% on the same categories. When food prices rise 28%, the low-income family loses an additional 10% of their discretionary income. The high-income family loses an additional 4%. The poor family cuts into necessities. The wealthy family cuts into luxuries. This is not speculation. This is federal data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Food inflation has been, and will continue to be, a mechanism of wealth transfer from lower-income households to the companies that produce and sell food. This is not intentional in the conspiratorial sense. No one sat in a room and designed it this way. But it is the mathematical outcome of the system we have built. And here's the uncomfortable historical echo. Every major inflationary period in modern history has coincided with increased social instability. Weimar Germany, 1970s America, Argentina in the 2000s, modern Venezuela. When populations feel that the basic promise of economic participation has been broken, when they work full-time and still cannot afford to eat well, they lose faith in the system. That loss of faith expresses itself differently across contexts, sometimes in protests, sometimes in elections, sometimes in violence. I am not predicting what form that expression will take in the United States. I am observing that the conditions which historically preceded social rupture are now present. What about technology? What about efficiency? What about innovation? This is the hope that many hold onto, the idea that innovation will somehow break the cost curve, that vertical farms, lab-grown meat, automation, or AI will disrupt the food system and bring prices down. Let me temper that hope with evidence. Vertical farming has been in development for over a decade. It produces approximately 0.001% of U.S. vegetables. The energy costs of indoor farming are 10 to 20 times higher than field farming. No commercial vertical farm has achieved profitability at scale. The technology exists, the economics don't. Lab-grown meat has been in development since 2013. 10 years later, you still cannot buy it at a grocery store. The production costs remain over $100 per pound. The regulatory pathway is uncertain. The consumer acceptance is unproven. Even optimistic projections put market relevance at 10 to 15 years away. Automation in agriculture is increasing. Tractors are more efficient. Harvesting machines are more sophisticated. But the labor-intensive steps, picking delicate produce, processing meat, stocking shelves, remain stubbornly manual. And automation requires capital investment, which raises near-term costs before it lowers long-term costs. AI can optimize logistics. It can reduce waste. It can improve yield predictions. But it cannot reduce the fundamental cost of energy, labor, land, and water. Technology will help at the margin. It will not reverse the structural shift. So where does this leave us? I've laid out the mechanisms: monetary expansion, energy repricing, consolidation, labor costs, climate adaptation. I've shown that each is permanent. I've shown that they compound. I've explained why political intervention fails. I've described who bears the cost. Now let me be precise about what I am not saying. I'm not saying food prices will hyperinflate. They won't. The United States is not Weimar Germany or Venezuela. The dollar remains the global reserve currency. The institutions are degraded but functional. The food system is stressed but not collapsing. I'm not saying there will be shortages. There likely won't be. American agriculture is productive enough to feed the population. The issue is price, not availability. I'm not saying you should panic. Panic changes nothing. Information changes decisions. What I am saying is this: the relationship between your income and your food cost has permanently shifted. The adjustment you've already made, buying less, choosing cheaper, skipping items, is not temporary. It's adaptive. It's the new equilibrium. The standard of living that a given income provided in 2019 is not the standard of living it provides in 2024, and it will not return. This is not a function of policy failure, though policy contributed. It's not a function of corporate greed, though corporations captured the margin. It's not a function of bad luck, though shocks accelerated the timeline. It is the outcome of systems designed to operate in conditions that no longer exist. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. In the 1970s, American families adapted to stagflation by fundamentally changing their consumption patterns. They bought smaller homes, they had fewer children, they drove smaller cars, they ate more processed food. Those adaptations became permanent. They defined the 1980s and 1990s. The culture shifted to accommodate the new economic reality. We are now in a similar inflection point. The adaptations families are making today, more cooking at home, less variety, more store brands, fewer luxuries, will define the 2030s. Children growing up now will consider these adaptations normal. They won't remember the before. And life will go on. People will work. People will eat. People will raise families. The system will function. But it will function differently. It will function with less slack, less margin, less forgiveness. It will function in a way that punishes downward mobility faster and rewards upward mobility slower. This is the world we've built. Unintentionally, structurally, irreversibly. A brief but necessary note. Everything I've shared today is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. It is not investment guidance. I'm not telling you what to buy, what to sell, or how to position your portfolio. I'm showing you the system. What you do with that understanding is your decision. Let me close where I opened. Sandra, the teacher in Ohio, still goes to the same grocery store every Sunday. Her cart is smaller than it used to be. She checks unit prices now, something she never did before. She has a mental list of things she used to buy that she no longer does. She isn't angry anymore. She's adjusted. Her children are adjusting too. They don't ask for the brand name cereal. They know the answer. This adjustment isn't a phase. It's a settlement. It's the acceptance of a new arrangement between what she earns and what she can afford. She doesn't fully understand why it happened. She heard about supply chains and Ukraine and corporate profits. It all sounded like noise. What she knows is the number on the receipt, $270. That number is not going back to $140. The mechanism that would reverse it does not exist. The dollars she earns today are not the dollars she earned in 2019. The food she buys today is not priced by the same system that priced it in 2019. The companies that sell to her have no incentive to lower prices. The government has no tool that forces them to. She is living in the new equilibrium. She just hasn't fully named it yet. But you have. You've seen the monetary expansion, the energy floor, the consolidated market power, the embedded wage costs, the climate adaptation burden. You've seen how they interlock, how none of them reverse, how they compound over time. You've seen the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This channel exists to trace the mechanics of systems that have already failed. Not to predict the future, not to tell you what to do, but to map the terrain so you can navigate it with clearer eyes. Most people experience economic shifts as weather. It rains, they get wet, they wait for sun, they don't ask why the climate changed. If you want to understand the climate, to see the systems beneath the symptoms, to study the autopsies before they're written, then consider subscribing. The patterns are already in motion. The only question is whether you see them before they arrive.